By the time of the massive importations of African slaves into the Western Hemisphere, slavery had long ago died out in most of Europe. Spain and Portugal were exceptions, however. In the 15th century, Lisbon alone imported more than 400 slaves per year, and slavery was not abolished in Portugal until 1773. The sugar industry in Madeira was estimated to have imported tens of thousands of African slaves during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. The dominance of Spain and Portugal in the Western Hemisphere during the era of European colonialism meant that both slaves and freedmen lived and developed under laws and customs that had a long tradition in the Iberian Peninsula. Portuguese Brazil, or the many Spanish colonies, therefore, differed in this respect from the Anglo-Saxon colonies of North America, which had no such legal or social tradition to draw upon in the British Isles. Various legal protections for slaves which had evolved over the centuries in Spain and Portugal have convinced some scholars that slavery was less severe in Latin America than in British North America, where no such legal protections existed in Anglo-Saxon law. But legal protection is only one factor affecting the treatment of slaves, and differing economic, demographic, and ideological characteristics are among the other variables at work. Empirically, the mortality rate among slaves in Latin America and the Caribbean was far higher than in the United States, and there is also other, more direct evidence that the treatment of slaves was generally as bad or worse in Latin slave societies. For example, although slave marriages and family life enjoyed legal protection under Portuguese law in Brazil, most Brazilian slaves did not live in family units, for the overwhelming majority of Brazilian slaves were males. And even when there were slave women, some Brazilian slave owners deliberately locked up men and women separately at night to prevent pregnancies. In the Brazilian economy, it was not considered profitable to raise slave children, and infant mortality claimed a great majority of children born to slave women. Suicides also appear to have been much more common among slaves in Brazil than in the United States. Nor was Brazil unique. In Latin America and the Caribbean in general, there were far more males than females, who were totally non-existent on some sugar plantations, and raising slave children was considered more costly than buying new adult slaves from Africa. The net result was a widespread dearth of family life among slaves, few children, and high infant mortality, all of which, together with killing overwork of adults, required constant, large-scale importations of new slaves from Africa as the native-born slave population continually died off. Suicides also occurred on a large scale among slaves in the Caribbean and Latin America. The laws that impressed later scholars were by no means readily available to slaves, who could be brutally punished by slave owners for making a complaint to the authorities, while economic consideration made slaves, including children, much more valuable in the United States than in Brazil, for example, which could import adult males from Africa at a closer distance with lower cost. A striking difference between the British colonies and the Spanish or Portuguese colonies was that men, women, and children were transported across the ocean from Britain to form something of a replica of the home society in continental North America, while the Spanish and Portuguese sent mostly men. Demographically, this meant that Canada and the United States became and remained predominantly white societies with black minorities, while much of the Caribbean has been predominantly black or mulatto, as was Brazil before the massive emigration from Europe that began in the late 19th century. Much of Spanish America, however, has been demographically dominated by mestizos, mixtures of whites and Indians, sometimes with African admixtures. Race relations in the Western Hemisphere have generally varied with these demographic differences. Although white supremacy has been the dominant theme in Western Hemisphere societies of British, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, or French origin, the manner and degree to which this principle was applied in practice has varied significantly. In the classic Anglo-Saxon patterns of Canada and the United States, there has been a stark dichotomy of black and white, cutting across all political, economic, and social lines, and with black meaning all individuals of discernible African ancestry, regardless of the degree of racial admixture. In the Latin colonies, however, the small, vastly outnumbered white enclaves followed a divide-and-conquer strategy, making significant legal, economic, and social distinctions between blacks and mulattoes, with the latter being elaborately subdivided by skin color or presumed degrees of white ancestry. The boundaries of whiteness have not been absolute in any of these societies, and the strictness of the definition has varied. Some people who would be considered white in Hispanic America would be considered black in the United States. In the Old South, 1 drop of Negro blood was said to make an individual black for all legal and social purposes, but in reality even the most racist Southern states allowed individuals with less than a given fraction of Negro ancestry to be legally considered white. It is estimated that tens of millions of white Americans have at least one black ancestor. However, even a man who has 7/8 Caucasian was defined as a Negro and subjected to the racial segregation laws, as in the case of Adolph Plessy, whose landmark Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson established the legal doctrine of separate but equal treatment. In much of Latin America, Plessy would have been considered white. In Brazil, a Negro is a person of African descent who has no white ancestry at all. But this definition would exclude about 3/4 of all American Negroes. The term mulatto is likewise defined differently in the two countries. In the United States, a mulatto has 1 white parent and 1 black parent, and given the broad definition of black, that means 50% or more Caucasian ancestry. But the term mulatto has been applied in Brazil to people with less than 50% Caucasian ancestry, and in fact with racial proportions not very different from those of the average American Negro. Within the Negro population, including blacks, mulattoes, and other coloreds, color lines have likewise varied as between Anglo-Saxon and Latin societies. Where all Negroes were lumped together by the dominant whites, internal color distinctions were less significant for Negroes themselves. Where important distinctions were made by whites between the blacks and the colored, Negroes have likewise attached greater significance to skin color differences in their own dealings with each other. While these distinctions have been socially significant throughout the Western Hemisphere, they have had less impact in the United States, for example, than in Latin America. Moreover, within the United States, skin color differences have had their greatest social impact in New Orleans, a former Latin American city, whose social patterns were well established before the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and whose colored population was greatly augmented by mulatto emigres from the Caribbean in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The British West Indies likewise reflected more of the Latin American pattern, but for a different reason. Although culturally Anglo-Saxon, the demographic makeup of the islands has historically been more like that of many Latin American colonies, overwhelmingly Negro, with the small white population being predominantly male, producing a racially mixed offspring. The divide-and-conquer strategy of distinguishing blacks from coloreds therefore emerged from the dominant but outnumbered whites of the West Indies. Instead of the stark racial dichotomy of continental North America, the British West Indies emphasized skin color gradations, an emphasis still surviving more strongly among 20th century West Indian Negroes than among American Negroes. From the earliest days of the black slave population in the Western Hemisphere, there also appeared mulatto populations, usually defined as half or more white. Many mulattoes remained slaves, but they were also disproportionately represented among free Negroes. Many mulattoes remained slaves, but they were also disproportionately represented among free Negroes. In the United States, for example, about 8% of the slaves were classified as mulattoes, compared to 37% of free Negroes. In Brazil, a majority of free Negroes were mulattoes, and an overwhelming majority of the slaves were black. Similarly, in Barbados, a majority of free Negroes were classified as colored, and throughout the Caribbean most free Negroes were of mixed ancestry, most slaves unmixed Africans, leading to a general tendency to call the former colored and the latter black. One reason for the differences of color and disparity of status among Negroes was that some slave owners freed children they had fathered by slave women, sometimes freeing the mother as well. This is not to say that most such children were freed. Rather, among those slaves who achieved freedom, this element was greatly overrepresented. Throughout the Western Hemisphere, there were consistently more females than males among the free Negro population, a sex imbalance growing out of the freeing of mothers of racially mixed children. Even under slavery, mulattoes, especially the offspring of white slave owners, had more opportunities to become house servants rather than field hands, urban slaves rather than plantation slaves, and skilled workers rather than cotton pickers or sugar cane cutters. In all these ways, they had more access to the dominant culture and more opportunity to obtain freedom by personal favor, self-purchase through spare-time earnings, or to successfully engineer an escape. The net result was that whether slave or free, those Negroes with a higher proportion of white ancestry had advantages: literacy, job skills, urbanization, and the values of the dominant culture to pass on to their descendants. Those descended from wealthier slave owners sometimes had money or property as well. Long after slavery, lighter-complexioned Negroes continued to be overrepresented among those with education, job skills, or general acculturation. Many of these attributed their advantages to genetic superiority. There are numerous gradations of racial mixture designated by a variety of names in Latin societies. The term black was considered insulting by the free colored populations, partly because it referred generally to slaves, and partly because of repugnance for Negroid features and African history. In later post-emancipation times, colored would be considered a more polite designation for Negroes in general, but a designation increasingly rejected by Negroes who resented the implication that there was something wrong with being black. The relative size of the free colored population varied greatly from country to country, ranging from about 10% of the total Negro population in the United States and Jamaica to more than half in colonial Brazil, as well as in the Spanish colonies in general. Brazil imported more than 6 times as many African slaves as the United States, although the surviving slave population was greater in the United States. The slave population of Brazil never reproduced itself like that of the United States, but was constantly replenished by new slaves from Africa. Among the consequences of this was a black population in which African cultures survived to a far greater extent than among American Negroes. Indeed, African words and pronunciations affected the Portuguese language as spoken by the white masses in Brazil. As late as the 19th century, at least 40% of the slaves in the provinces of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were African-born. By contrast, in the contemporary United States, 99% of the slaves were American-born. The massive importation of Africans to Brazil was facilitated by its geographic proximity to Africa, but it was necessitated by a large loss of slaves, one, due to a high mortality rate under the brutal conditions of Brazilian slavery. Some slaves were literally whipped to death or thrown into pools of piranhas or boiled in oil, and two, the widespread achievement of freedom by slaves in Brazil. As early as the 18th century, there were more than 2/3 as many free Negroes as slaves. By 1808, there were more free Negroes than slaves. The Portuguese colonists in Brazil were predominantly male. This meant that sexual liaisons with black and Indian women were widespread, leading to a complex stratification of racially mixed offspring. By the late 18th century, whites constituted less than 1/5 of the population of the country, and as late as 1821, whites were only about 1/4 the population. outnumbered both by mulattoes and by blacks. Only the massive immigration of Europeans to Brazil, beginning in the late 19th century, produced a predominantly white population. However, the term white, branco, is used more flexibly in Brazil than in Anglo-Saxon countries, and especially so in the province of Bahia, where Negroes have historically been concentrated. Nearly one-fifth of the Brancos in Bahia in the 1930s were mulattoes in North American terminology. As in the United States, the European immigrants moved primarily into those parts of the country where slave plantations were not predominant. As a result, there have been large regional variations in the racial composition of the Brazilian population. As of 1890, Brancos were about one-third of the population of Bahia, but nearly two-thirds of the population of the state of Sao Paulo and four-fifths of the population of the city of Sao Paulo. Mining booms and attendant urban commercial development in 18th century Brazil created many opportunities for the slaves to earn money in their spare time and to purchase their freedom with their savings. This was an established practice, legally recognized under Portuguese law in colonial Brazil. The lack of artisans among the Portuguese overlords created an opportunity for slaves to earn money by becoming carpenters or barbers, or to acquire other artisan skills. Most of the barbers in 18th century Brazil were slaves. Some slaves worked as clerks in their masters' stores and became acquainted with business operations well enough to conduct some on their own. Slave men and women became peddlers, and some women became prostitutes. In addition, there were fraternal organizations of blacks or mulattoes that made loans to slaves to buy their own freedom and repay the money in installments. Free blacks and free coloreds were subject to many legal discriminations in colonial Brazil. Forbidden to enter many occupations, hold many military or civil offices, or even to wear clothing considered to be above their assigned place in Brazilian society. Still, there was some progress over time, and by the early 19th century, blacks and mulattoes dominated virtually all the skilled trades in Brazil. The Portuguese disdained manual labor, leaving these opportunities for non-whites. Many free blacks and free mulattoes became cattle raisers, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and peddlers, jobs which both slaves and white men were constrained from filling for different reasons. However, there was economic retrogression for Negroes in Brazil in the last quarter of the 19th century, when they faced the competition of a massive inflow of immigrants from Europe, many of whom did not share the Portuguese reluctance to perform manual labor. Throughout the history of Brazil, many mulattoes have attempted to escape racial discrimination by passing as whites. As in much of Latin America, wealth facilitated acceptance as white, and at one time official certificates of whiteness were for sale. In the 18th century, when a question was raised as to whether a certain official was a mulatto, the answer was, "He was, but is not anymore." In parts of 20th century Brazil, it is said that where there was sugar, there are Negroes. That is, the present geographical distribution of blacks, mulattoes, and others of various degrees of African ancestry reflect the past distribution of sugar plantations worked by slaves. In the state of Bahia, in tropical northeastern Brazil, whites were less than one-third of the population in the middle of the 20th century, though a majority in the country as a whole. Brazil today is a country of many kinds and degrees of racial mixtures, among Caucasians, mostly Portuguese, indigenous Indians, and people of Negro stock. These various racial mixtures are differently represented at different socioeconomic levels, whites at the top and blacks at the bottom, and a wide range of racial combinations and degrees are socially important. But by and large, Brazil has not had the degree of racial rigidity or hostility found in most multiracial and multi-ethnic societies. While such racial hostilities in the United States have often been attributed to a legacy of slavery, the Brazilian experience at least raises questions about that explanation, for slavery persisted in Brazil longer than in any other Western nation, being abolished only in 1888, a quarter of a century later than in the United States. Perhaps equally important, however, is that most Brazilians of African descent were freed before slavery was abolished as an institution. Black and slave were not synonymous. Moreover, in direct contrast to the United States, it is precisely in the regions of Brazil where blacks are most concentrated, notably Bahia, that race relations are best, and it is the lower-class whites who seem to get along best with dark Brazilians and intermarry with them the most. At the end of the 18th century, there were more than 400,000 free Negroes in Brazil, and by the time slavery was abolished, there were about 3 times as many free Negroes as slaves. This contrasts sharply with the U.S. experience, where 90% of the Negro population was freed as a result of the Civil War. In Brazil, at least half of the Negro population had been free for at least a generation by the time the institution of slavery was abolished. Though racism, as such, is not as prominent a feature of Brazilian society as of other multiracial societies, Brazil has highly rigid class lines and a distribution of income that is much more unequal than that of the United States, for example. The small upper class is almost exclusively white. In such a country, where the top 5% of employed individuals receive half the national income, class differences are also racial differences. Whether measured by income or property, whites are significantly more prosperous than mulattoes, and mulattoes more prosperous than blacks. As in much of the Western Hemisphere, this reflects historic advantages going back for centuries. For all its more relaxed race relations, Brazil has larger black-white disparities than the United States in education and in political participation. Blacks are also extremely rare in high positions in the professions or other high-level occupations in Brasilia. There are difficulties in trying to use terminology that will describe the same sorts of people in both Brazil and the United States. However, darker-skinned individuals seem not to have risen as rapidly in Brazil as in the United States. Indeed, even mixed-blood Negro individuals have risen less in class in Brazil than in the United States. This suggests that racism may be less of a factor in economic advancement than is commonly supposed. Historic head starts in acculturation seem as highly correlated with economic advancement in comparing people of African ancestry in Brazil and the United States as in making internal comparisons among the Negro populations of both countries. The West Indies. The British West Indies followed an economic and social development pattern quite different from that of the British colonies on the North American continent. While Canada and the 13 American colonies were settled by whole families and communities of whites, the population of the British West Indian colonies, principally Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, consisted overwhelmingly of black slaves, controlled by a contingent of white male overseers, attorneys, and other auxiliary personnel. Giant plantations, much larger than in the United States, were the dominant mode of production. Sugar was the dominant crop, and the owners of these plantations typically lived in England, leaving day-to-day control in the hands of overseers. All these features help shape the history of blacks and coloreds in the West Indies. Absentee ownership in the West Indian colonies, as in the southern United States or Latin America, typically meant short-run maximization of output, with little concern for long-run effects on the slaves or on the plantation land and structures. But while absentee ownership was the exception in the United States, it was the rule in the West Indies. Resident plantation owners in the United States had an economic incentive to protect their own long-term investment in slaves and plantations, even though overseers' incentives were to concern themselves only with current output on which their commissions or reputations depended. This conflict of interest, which was usually resolved in favor of plantation owners in the United States, was typically resolved in favor of the overseers in the West Indies, because the plantation owner in London could not monitor his day-to-day activities. West Indian slaves were therefore treated somewhat differently from slaves in the United States, usually more brutally and with less concern for the fate of infants or pregnant women. In the West Indies, where it was considered cheaper to buy new slaves than to maintain the existing population, infant mortality was several times higher than in the American South, where resident plantation owners and their wives protected their long-term economic interest represented by new slaves. Nearly 2 million slaves were imported into the British West Indies before the slave trade was abolished in 1808, almost 5 times the number imported into the United States, which had a far larger total black population. The difference was that slaves had higher death rates and lower birth rates in the West Indies. Partly this reflected more cruel treatment in the West Indies, but partly, too, it reflected the greater biological vulnerability of African slaves to European diseases, as compared to native slaves who had acquired biological resistance and immunity to such diseases. Jamaica was long a seasoning ground for newly enslaved Africans, a place where they were broken into their new role as slaves, acquired some acquaintance with the language and culture, and some measure of biological resistance. Some of these seasoned slaves were then shipped to other places, including the United States. American slaves were thus not genetically different from those of the West Indies, but were both biologically and culturally different. African cultural survivals were much more common in the West Indies, where new Africans continually reinforced their homeland cultures. The huge size of the West Indian slave population, relative to that of free whites or free Negroes, meant that the feeding of slaves could not be done by purchases of food from the non-slave population. Slaves had to grow the bulk of their own food, and both time and land had to be set aside for this purpose. Contemporary observers noted that the slaves worked much harder on their individual plots than in the routine plantation work. West Indian slaves and free Negroes together were major suppliers of food to the larger society. Barbados, for example, depended almost wholly on them for food, and huckstering was deeply embedded in the cultural system of non-whites there. Thus, even during the era of slavery, West Indian Negroes, both slave and free, had economic incentives to exercise initiative as well as experience in buying, selling, and managing their own affairs. This experience was usually denied slaves in the United States, who were issued rations and who were deliberately kept in a state of dependence which was not feasible under West Indian conditions. Another consequence of the preponderance of blacks in the West Indian population was that slave uprisings were more feasible than in the United States, where the power of the predominantly white community foredoomed such rebellions. In the West Indies, however, there were not only rebellions, but enclaves of escaped slaves operating as continuing communities for decades. American slave owners preferred to hire married overseers to minimize the problems created by sex relations between an overseer and slave women. In the West Indies, however, there were very few white women, and most overseers were bachelors. It was a pervasive pattern among these bachelor overseers to have a slave woman as concubine, more or less openly acknowledged. Moreover, the shortage of white women in the West Indies meant that other white men in the colony had a demand for Negro women, a demand satisfied in part by hiring slave women out as prostitutes and partly by having free colored concubines. The net result was the growth of a mulatto population. Both slave children, often freed along with their mothers, and the offspring of temporary unions of sojourning white bachelors who would someday return to England for legal marriage with an Englishwoman. As elsewhere in the hemisphere, a colored population had advantages over the black population, both financially and in acculturation, and these tangible differences in turn led many of the racially mixed Negroes to disdain and separate themselves from the darker masses. Unlike the stark black-white dichotomy of North American Anglo-Saxon societies, the West Indian society had an elaborately graded skin color hierarchy reminiscent of Spanish colonies. While whites monopolized the most lucrative and prestigious positions in the West Indies, there were simply not enough of them to restrict free Negroes to purely menial jobs. The free colored were carpenters, masons, plumbers, small businessmen, and worked in other occupations requiring skill, initiative, or education. Some even became owners of estates and slaves. But despite their economic standing, free Negroes were neither legally nor socially granted equality with whites, but were constantly reminded of their inferior status by discriminatory laws and by such social practices as referring to them without the usual courtesy titles of Mr. or Miss. Thwarted in attempting to advance beyond limits set by whites, and unwilling to identify with blacks, the free colored population of the West Indies became an inbred group whose values were expressed in genteel etiquette and status-giving possessions. The free colored population of Jamaica was tiny but rapidly growing. In 1722, when the total population of Jamaica was about 88,000 people, less than 1% were free colored, compared to 9% white and 89% slaves. By 1800, however, the free colored were about 3% of the island's total population of 340,000, with whites now 10%, and the slaves still the overwhelming majority at 88%. The colored portion of the Jamaican population continued to rise after the abolition of slavery in 1834, reaching 18% of the total population by 1844. In Barbados, the free Negro population was about 5% in the 1820s, and just over half were colored rather than black. About 62% of all Barbadian slaves freed were female, reflecting the common practice of freeing slave mothers and their children sired by overseers. Emancipation in the West Indies in 1834 was followed by a period of economic dislocation and a virtual re-enslavement of the blacks by debt peonage. The small minority of whites continued dominant in the colony's economy, society, and political apparatus. Many non-white West Indians sought their fortunes abroad, notably in the United States. More than 1 million West Indians, virtually all Negro, have moved to the United States since the 19th century, about 300,000 during the first 3 decades of the 20th century.
Slavery was big business. Africans sold other Africans to the Europeans. We can only begin to imagine the sheer horror of the slave trade.
Okay.
Yep.
How do you think he was captured?
Probably through a war. You know, there were African middlemen, and they would fight wars with other Africans to enslave them to sell to the white man. Slavery was a huge business for different African kingdoms. You know the story that we got when we were kids, that your ancestor was out on one Sunday with his girlfriend and some white man jumps out of the bush and throws a net over him? It's not how it happened. Slavery was big business. Africans sold other Africans to the Europeans.
So after he was snatched from Africa, came over on a slave ship, on that long boat ride.
From hell.
Yes.
This is the Burrow House, a plantation home in tiny Stateburg, South Carolina, about 10 miles west of Sumter. It has been the site of many Forrest Gump-like moments. General Thomas Sumter lived here. Former Governor Stephen Miller lived here. Joel Poinsett, for whom the poinsettia is named, died here. Even Samuel Maverick, whose son became the namesake for the term independent rebel, owned this house on the property.
A lot of really important but not splashy historic people have wandered through here.
Perhaps the quietest of them all has arguably the most important story to tell. It began here in 1935 when 3 young girls discovered a stack of letters while playing in the basement of this home. Those letters, now held at USC's Caroliniana Library, tell the story of a slave named April.
There's been a really good job of whitewashing a very awkward discussion.
It's a hugely awkward discussion.
In 1802, a white plantation owner named William Ellison lent one of his young slaves, April, to work for a gin maker in Winnsboro. April quickly became the go-to man for repairing the expensive cotton gins throughout the Sumter area.
They send him out to the plantations and they take them apart. He would sharpen them on location. And that's why he heard about Stateburg. He came through here as a young man, and he said, well, when he bought his freedom or whatever, he came here.
The center of plantation country, the wealthiest area of South Carolina. He changed his name. April was now known as William Ellison, the name of his former white owner. His gin business prospered. He bought this home, hundreds of acres of land, and eventually 68 slaves to work that land. Granger McCoy now lives in the Ellison home and says he often finds old cotton gin blades.
What do the Ellisons say when they come?
They looking for the home place.
All descendants of what many of us thought an impossible oxymoron, a black slave owner.
I had a black ophthalmologist come through here, Ellison, and we sat on this couch right here. And his great-great-granddaddy owned 68 slaves, and here I am, white, over here, and my great-great-granddaddy didn't own any slaves. And it was like somebody blew a dog whistle in a kennel. Everybody was just kind of turning their head, not knowing how to handle all this.
History tumbles you.
And what little we can learn about Ellison as a slave owner isn't pretty. The book Black Masters chronicles Ellison's life in the antebellum South and suggests that his slaves were the worst fed and clothed of any in Stateburg. It also suggests that Ellison was a slave breeder, selling off infant girls, a practice even some white owners found cruel. Whatever the case, Ellison certainly had a good relationship with other white aristocracy. This contract shows that Ellison didn't just buy a home in wealthy Stateburg, he bought it directly from former Governor Stephen Miller, a governor and former slave trading property. He was the wealthiest black man in South Carolina, the fourth wealthiest in the South, wealthier than more than 90% of whites. Just a few hundred yards from the Ellison home is the Ellison graveyard, private, neither mixed with other white nor black tombstones, symbolic of his unusual position in the pre-war South, a position so few of us even knew existed.
Whatever happened during Reconstruction, and then up through the Jim Crow era, anything and everything that had to deal with the relationships between the blacks and the whites just went underground.
And may have remained so, if not for a stack of letters found under his house. For Hidden Columbia, Anderson Burns, ABC Columbia News.